Well, welcome to Talkcast and to a deep dive today into Karl Popper's The Myth of the Framework. Over the years on Talkcast, I've taken a number of these deep dives into Popper's works, his most influential essays or lectures. For example, The Aim of Science here, or On Knowledge and of Ignorance, or Objective Knowledge. So what's the point? Well, as with my series on The Beginning of Infinity and The Fabric of Reality, this is not simply just a reading exercise. I'm not simply the narrator. Sure, I do read bits, quite significant tracts, in fact, of Popper's writing or David Deutsch's work, but then I discuss them. And, with Popper in particular, I discuss in light of more modern language use, because sometimes the language gets a little bit dated after many decades, and also in light of what else we know today about, in particular, epistemology, and physics and science more generally, and perhaps even in light of our present circumstances as compared to his circumstances, historically speaking. Things change over the decades, but some things are timeless. Sure, his philosophy and epistemology, timeless to a point, but the practical application of the lessons he teaches, well, that depends upon where you are, what's happening, and what you're interested in. In other words, in Popper's phraseology, your problem situation. In today's episode, and over the next few episodes, I assume it's going to take 4 or 5 episodes to get through this, I come to something that has been actually in the works for some time now, and I'm just getting around to recording and publishing it. I've read this essay or lecture by Popper many times, and recently I've been listening to it. I've got the audiobook, and you can get the entire audiobook on Audible. I'm not being paid for that, by the way. It's just I find it useful if you really want the ideas to get in your head, at least for me, not only to read or not only to listen, but to do both. I don't know, maybe it's just me. More about my process, because I've been asked a little bit about this recently. And today's episode is really going to largely be an introduction to the myth of the framework. We will get through some parts of it. It's in 16 parts. I'll get through 3 of the parts today, because this is going to be an extra long introduction. But as a meta point, I have been asked on occasion what it is I do, as with the Fabric of Reality and the Beginning of Infinity, what my technique is in order to learn, so to speak, the content of the work. I've already said so far that I read it and then I like to listen to it as well. When I first started reading The Fabric of Reality and the Beginning of Infinity, I did it cover to cover. And I probably did it cover to cover, I can't remember how many times. And then I would discuss it and I would go back and read entire chapters. And then once the audiobooks came out for both of them, I would listen and re-listen to those. Again, as I say, my memory is such that when I hear something, perhaps after having read it, it seems to sink in, or I gain new insights while walking around my local neighborhood or wherever it happens to be, while listening to an audiobook. And then for some reason, visual cues in the environment tend to cause aha moments in my mind as I'm listening. I don't know what that is. It's an interesting phenomenon, but again, maybe that's just me. When I'm preparing for something like this, I take notes as well, of course, while I am walking, usually on just the Notes app or something like that. Questions, curiosities, important points, that kind of thing that I think I want to emphasize as I'm doing my exposition and explanation, and whatever else I want to cover that I think might be timely applications of the timeless. Quite often, if I'm writing down questions or curiosities I have, another thinker will crop up in my mind. I'll think, what would Steven Pinker have said about this? And often he'll have said something. Or Sam Harris, or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or Gad Saad, or Jordan Peterson, whoever it happens to be who's popular in the zeitgeist now. These people are important sometimes to refer to for my listeners because they're also on podcasts doing intellectual type things, and because they're famous right now, maybe their content isn't quite so timeless. Nonetheless, they'll often cross over with the kind of content that Popper has done before, and I would often say better, when it comes to issues of epistemology and how we know and what critical thinking is all about and all that kind of thing. So often I'll jot down, who else is talking about this particular stuff right now? And then I can do a compare and contrast before actually committing my thoughts to posterity, so to speak, publicly here on the YouTubes and on podcasts and wherever else this happens to be recorded for almost all time, at least so long as civilization lasts. This episode today is a case in point. It's taken me much longer than any other things that I can or do produce, because a lot of that other stuff is done just off the top of my head, casually, without a huge amount of preparation. This, on the other hand, has taken me quite a bit of preparation in order to refine what I really thought Popper was trying to get at. Because there's a number of themes, and many people have read this before and commented on what it's about. But I'm going to tell you something different about what I think it's about. Because although apparently written in 1994, this particular essay, it appears to be reaching across time, as it were, speaking to, among other things, proponents and opponents like me of the woke brigade of the 2020s. So maybe now, as you're watching this, you're thinking to yourself, woke, that's old news, it's on the decline, so is DEI. But the thing is that woke, among many things that it contains hints, or more than hints, of relativism. Relativism including cultural relativism. And that's what Popper is in part speaking about in The Myth of the Framework, doing a wonderful job of critiquing it. Diversity, it is said, when it comes to cultural relativism, or the more narrow form that it takes up, woke and DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, that whole movement says that diversity consists of people of different genders. That's diverse. People of different sexualities is diverse. Different races, perhaps different ages, different genetic or physical makeups. People who look different on the exterior. That's diversity, so we are told and taught by these DEI people. Never mind their psychological makeup, never mind what's going on mentally with them, never mind their background knowledge. All of that stuff, irrelevant. What's really important is the external manifestation of your genotype, your phenotype, in other words. That is what causes diversity. And that is what is valuable, and that is what certain politicians have said is our strength. It is literally about looks. It's skin deep. That's how superficial it is. So this whole thing is not new. DEI is not new. It's a rebranding of an old idea. And it can be traced in many ways to forms of relativism. I will come to explain more as we go through this series, and in particular today, about what I'm talking about when it comes to that. As I say, the whole concept of diversity is literally about looks. And if people look different, so we're told, then they will necessarily have, apparently, different perspectives. Because, so we are told, you cannot understand the perspective. You cannot, in principle, understand the perspective of someone who is, say, a different shade of skin colour to you. You might say, look, Brett, DEI is basically DEAD now. Forget about it. Now, I do concede that there's been a sea change politically, perhaps for the good, in many countries in the mid-2020s. So surely that nonsense is going to be left behind. It is on the decline now. Well, we cannot prophesy. We cannot use the past to predict the future. However, historically, these kind of movements, like woke, like DEI, rebrand themselves, and the old ideological battles must be fought again. Now, the interesting thing about woke is, and Naval and David Deutsch were talking together with me about this in one of our Deutsch files, I think number 4, the most recent one that's there on Naval's website. And David and Naval were talking about the differences and similarities between woke and the old communist movement. And older communist movements, let's call it in the 60s and the 70s, students then who were animated as great flag bearers for communism, they understood, they had an argument, they could tell you the theory of Marxism and tell you a theory of wages and tell you a theory about what the role of government was. They could answer these questions, whereas the woke brigade, not so much apparently. Or can they? Because sometimes it depends upon the sophistication of the particular person you're speaking with. And there are a lot of people, for example, in modern union movements who can give you some account of the role of government and the importance of, let's say, socialism. However, whatever the case, the commonalities include the fact that communism, like woke, like DEI, modern manifestations of socialism, various other movements that go under this collectivist umbrella, they tend to be refuted over time, shown to be wrong economically, and as a matter of human rights, There's any number of ways in which arguments can be brought forth to show you that these ideas contain a poverty of prescriptions for the way in which society should run. All of that can be true, but even though they get refuted, somehow they survive. Somehow they survive. Marxism tends, collectivism tends, tribalism tends to rebrand itself, to survive in the presence of Enlightenment ideals. Popper himself was one of the greatest enemies and critics of Marxism, but he admitted his own failure. He felt he barely shifted the needle at all when it came to countering or pushing back against communism, Marxism, totalitarianism, fascism, all of these movements of the same kind of authoritarianism in government.
There are practically no totalitarian societies, or totalitarian societies are on the way out, and to a certain extent your idea of the open society seems to be adopted, seems to be accepted by many people that we wouldn't have guessed so far that they would have accepted it. What have you got to say to this?
I think, especially in political matters, an optimist. But I think you are too optimistic. I don't see at all that China is in any way affected by the breakdown of the Soviet communism, to take one thing. I personally, I must point out, I'm almost 91 years old, and I have been really thinking about these matters since the First World War. And in my opinion, the Marxists are unteachable. This is so difficult to eradicate. As you know, with my book, I've tried to eradicate it for 50 years.
But somehow, again, as I say, those ideas survive. They're sticky memes. So whatever the case, perhaps you are optimistic that DEI is G-O-N-E. We can only hope. I'd like to think so. But my guess is that relativism and denigration of the Enlightenment and so on, those ideas survive and will continue to survive, not least within the education system, and will continue to be taught for some generations yet to come, quite formally. I mean, you can fiddle with the knobs of a curriculum, but teachers and the teachers of teachers are heavily indoctrinated politically, and heavily indoctrinated with how to heavily indoctrinate new cohorts of students. They, the teachers and the teachers' teachers, lean very heavily in one political direction. That's the way in which they are promoted, that's the way in which they get funding and all this kind of stuff. Not only do they teach new cohorts of students, they teach new cohorts of students how to be activists, how to get out there, never mind learning in the classroom, to get out there and to agitate for change in the direction of collectivism. And teachers teach vast numbers of students from all the way from ages 5 through to 25 if they stay at university doing master's degrees or PhDs and that kind of thing. So for 20 years, for 2 full decades, many people in the West can begin to be indoctrinated at age 5 with communist, collectivist ideas and taught about all the evils of humankind and capitalism and freedom and all that kind of thing, and they learn to be authoritarians of a sort. Those people, from 5 through to 25, some of them, at least some of them, will go off to occupy positions in academia and business and government, and they propagate and promote those ideas and promote people on the basis that they can also ape the policies of the ruling classes, of the elite, so to speak. And so the ideological merry-go-round continues. How to counter this? How can we push back? What do we do? One way to counter this, in your own mind at least, is to read the right books. Read Karl Popper, read David Deutsch, read Rand and Soul, and generally try to counter the formal teaching that is going on in many places today. So you're already doing the work. And then to go out and to talk about these particular ideas, oppose and criticize and create your own versions of how to explain the values that you think are important for progress and creativity and making the world generally better in terms of progress to objectively improve things. Woke or DEI may be on the nose, but as I say, this might simply cause it to rebrand. As what? Well, that's anyone's guess. It could metastasize into any number of tumorous forms. In any case, it's all cultural relativism, you will find, of a kind anyway. This idea that we need people who look like us in order to represent us or help us or understand us. The idea that only people who look like you can understand you is racism to the core, a dangerous and perverse denial of our capacity as human beings to understand one another, basically no matter what, at least in principle. Because in principle, we can just use our reason continuously, and reason is bottomless. You just keep asking honest, probing questions until you have an understanding of something, including someone else's perspective. Yes, in practice, this may be hard, but problems are soluble, as we say around here. This essay, The Myth of the Framework by Popper, is difficult to categorise if you ask a simple question. What's it about? Well, you might very well say it's a critique of relativism, but I've already done a lot of those already from my own perspective on the topic. I've explained Popper's view on that kind of thing, postmodernism and relativism before, and David Deutsch's views. See, for example, this, A Physicist's History of Bad Philosophy, for more about all of that. So it is a critique of relativism, but it's a lot more than that, the myth of the framework here. I like to think of it as an instruction manual for discussion. People talk about having upgrades to their brain when reading the work of David Deutsch or Karl Popper. This is certainly like a firmware upgrade for your mind, a supplementary module, if you like. Plug it in, and if you really can take it on board, then all sorts of things follow. For example, you can be far more at peace during discussions, no matter how far apart you are from your interlocutor. And it's about fun. It's all about learning from anyone and indeed everyone. It's all of those things. I will get to the essay, I promise, but this introduction is, I think, important because I want to set the essay in our time, and I've already done a little bit of that. Even if the essay itself is timeless. I know, a word I'm coming to overuse, I do hear you. Anyway, Popper seems almost prescient with this work. Almost. We need lessons like those contained here in the myth of the framework right now. There's no less use for this piece, the myth of the framework, than when he wrote it. In fact, it may be more important than ever. Popper loved discussions and talking and communicating. He was a master of exposition. Despite his heavy Austrian accent, you can just listen to the clarity of his words.
The amoeba to Einstein both work with the same method, namely the trial and error method. But there is this one step which makes all the difference. Einstein is critical of his theory. Einstein actually says, I don't think my theory is satisfactory. That he said of his own theory of gravitation. And point out why he doesn't think it is too satisfactory. Einstein spent the whole of his life from producing this theory, his theory of gravitation, the so-called general theory of relativity, in approximately 1916. The whole rest of his life, till his death, which was about 1952, I think.
Something like that.
By trying to improve this theory of his, by trying to find a better version of his theory of general theory of relativity, which was also his theory of gravitation.
Might be a cliche to say, but couldn't you listen to him all day? You can, there's enough recordings of him out there to almost do that. But could he have imagined, in all of his brilliance, what things would be like some 30 years later. Of course not. They'd be the first to admit it. Near instantaneous communication between people separated by opposite sides of the earth, and therefore bringing together quite opposite perspectives on what is going on in the world, scientifically, politically, historically. This brings the concept of culture clash into view in a way I guess might never have occurred to him or anyone else much before the internet. And Popper is going to talk in this very essay, we're going to get to that, not today, but soon, about the concept of culture clash. It's a big theme that runs through this essay, both the good and the bad. The idea is that with culture clashes, discussions can always, or almost always, be fruitful if you're willing to actually put a little bit of effort in. Your aim is never to win a discussion. It's to learn. Always. People complain, well, let's face it, mainly the people I complain about, they complain, the pessimists complain, that social media causes untold ills in the world, that it destroys or even has destroyed civil discourse and so on. The fact is, people are talking with each other more than ever. The sword has been replaced with the keyboard, happily. There is more speech, more discussion, and more dialogue and communication than ever before. And emotions on either side of any dispute, big or small, are roughly as they always have been. How to navigate this? What is rational? What generates progress? What creates fun? What does it mean to be caught in an echo chamber? That often used phrase to denigrate the people that you enjoy most speaking with. I think we can answer that one here and now, this idea of echo chamber. Your framework is your echo chamber. It's not all bad. If you share lots of background knowledge with someone, that's your shared framework, your assumptions and so on about what's going on. You can share your framework, your echo chamber, with someone else, and as we'll hear from Popper, discussions can go very easily the more you have in common with someone. But those discussions, easy as they are, might not be fruitful. That's another thing. In other words, it could get a bit boring or not. It depends on what your purpose is in sitting down and talking with someone. But hopefully it's almost always for fun. There are exceptions, of course. Anyway, if you have your framework over here, the echo chamber of your knowledge and people that you know, it's called an echo chamber because it's as if you're only talking to yourself. But people only ever talk about echo chambers that they see over there, someone else. They're in the echo chamber. But you, of course, you're never in an echo chamber. You are a well-versed person across all perspectives, right? Well, everyone accuses everyone else of being in an echo chamber. Whatever the case, my interpretation of echo chamber is framework. If there's an echo chamber over there, or a framework over there, completely different to yours, utterly different in many ways, you might find discussion with anyone coming from that framework, coming out of their echo chamber to talk to you. You might find it very difficult to have that discussion. It could devolve, especially online, into so-called flame wars, or it could be extremely fruitful. How can it be fruitful? Don't you need to agree to certain things if you're going to talk to someone who's coming from an utterly different perspective to you? Well, you might want to agree not to punch each other in the face. That would be a good starting point. But normally, in reasonable, rational, Enlightenment Western traditions, that goes without saying. I should hope anyway. But the point is that if someone with a very different perspective to you comes to you and wants to have a talk with you, you can learn a lot, each from each other or even from yourself, and have a, as Popper says, fruitful discussion. A discussion where lots of learning is going on. And in order to do this, the key we will learn, and we'll even hear some of this today, is that there is no need to agree on things like definitions or starting points. Popper will give interesting examples about how people with incommensurate views can still learn from each other even if they do not reach agreement, which also does not need to be an objective, by the way. It may happen. You may reach agreement with someone or you may not. The point is, always, are you still learning while engaged in this discussion and enjoying the experience of discussing as well? Learning is inherently fun. Which reminds me, as a personal aside, I am not just picking this essay and saying, oh look, Karl Popper's written something again, it must be a work of genius because everything Popper ever writes is genius. Or David Deutsch recommends Karl Popper, and David Deutsch has recommended before, read The Myth of the Framework, and therefore if David Deutsch says it and he's a genius and he's talking about Karl Popper who's a genius, then of course me, Brett Hall, I am going to tell you about it as well. And that's why I'm discussing this essay. No. Again, this is a really timeless essay with lots of timeless lessons and messages in it that can be applied to timely issues of our time. And I find producing content about this kind of stuff lots of fun. It's interesting to engage with this because it is inherently engaging. Karl Popper is a genius, and the way in which he conjures language in order to get across these deep ideas using an economy of words as part of his second language is second to none. The originality of the thought, second to none. Of course, we read it now and we go, oh, okay, I understand a lot of that. But he came up with it first. This is the amazing thing about so much of what we read in Karl Popper's works. And that's why I find this so exciting, because he is engaging. People tend to watch my stuff and become engaged themselves and send me questions via email or on X or some other forum. They like sharing ideas and the life of the mind. Of course, no one only listens to me. They like talking about this kind of stuff and encountering those who don't yet know about the work of David Deutsch, Karl Popper, and associated thinkers. So I do hear from people who watch Talkcast and who've listened to David Deutsch, perhaps read some of his books, and who are fans of the work of Karl Popper. And they say they've listened to this or that podcast, or they've watched this particular YouTube by some new contemporary thinker, and that person may disagree with something I've said or something David has said, and they want to try and square the circle and iron out the wrinkles. And often it comes down to different perspectives on rationality. Even modern thinkers today who have all the trappings of 2025 or whatever year it is you happen to be watching this, they will be espousing a version of the intellectual life of the mind which is nonetheless what I would regard as dated. Old ideas about induction and so on and so forth. So often misconceptions come down to, even if you are a modern, intellectual, scientifically minded thinker, disputes about how knowledge is created, the purpose of science, and that kind of thing. And I find that absolutely fascinating because many really smart and successful and wealthy people think that they're smart and successful, wealthy people precisely because they understand stuff like knowledge. They rarely do. Very few people understand this stuff that Karl Popper is talking about. And yet they manage to become wealthy and famous and successful and all this kind of stuff, despite, in spite of having a false epistemology, and sometimes a bad epistemology as well. People come to me as well who are fans of mine, and they themselves have been involved in discussions or often debates, and they want to know how to put things a little better. Now, often this itself is an impulse that needs to be countered from within, because that itself can be an error. This idea that you want to debate the ideas and you want to win against your interlocutor. You want to become a defender of something or other, some movement. Now, I think it's important to defend the Enlightenment, absolutely. But if you put a finer point on it, you want to be a defender of critical rationalism or a defender of Karl Popper or a defender of objectivism or capitalism, then you've got a problem. What you really need is to be an explainer. Expositor, perhaps. But defender, that's different. People accuse me of this all the time, by the way, just to concentrate on myself, as boring as that can be, perhaps. They accuse me of setting up Deutsch and Popper as ideals or authorities, and me of being a dogmatist. They claim that I speak about fallibilism, but act as if Deutsch and Popper are infallible sources of knowledge. Now, nothing could be further from the truth, which is why some of my episodes, like this one, take so long to construct. When I put something like this out into the world, publish it, I want to understand it to the point I can anticipate questions and have the answers, which is what I've tried to do today. It's not what I always do, but sometimes I do. I really enjoy getting questions on my content that I've never had before. But the rule is that I get questions that I've heard 100 times before. Okay, maybe a dozen. But I've usually heard the questions before. Maybe not daily, but certainly a few times a week I will get emails from people I've never met before, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful to get these. But the questions that are asked are often questions that I've encountered many times before. And I wish I had a simple way of quickly responding. Like I need to have some sort of back catalogue of stock answers. How do you test the multiverse, for example? Do we really guess our way to knowledge? Surely there's something more important than that. All of these kind of misconceptions, things that I've explained before. How do you know there can't be a superintelligence, Brett Hall? Why are you being so dogmatic about that? Now, this is all lots of fun. It's also why I do live streams from time to time. But my little secret is, truly, I criticize my own content before I put it out, thinking carefully about how it might be wrong. Sometimes I play the part myself, as I did when I was constructing this one, of the Marxist or environmentalist, postmodernists or standard intellectual rationalists, empiricists and so on. After all, at one point or another throughout my intellectual life, I have myself tended in those directions. Everyone likes to try on a new jacket for a little while, don't they? How's it feel? How's it feel to be a religious type thinker for a moment? Just try it on for size. See how it looks on you. See if you understand what it's like to be a religious thinker or a postmodernist or an environmentalist and so on. But I totally get it. This exposition I'm going to deliver, as I say, for the next 4 or 5 episodes, is going to seem like so much of what I do, which is, it seems like evangelizing. Perhaps many of my episodes do. And I've heard that critique over and again, and I'm weary of it, and I don't really mind. And if you think I'm evangelizing, so be it. It really isn't. It's just exposition, sometimes expansion, extrapolation, that kind of thing, using examples. It's not really evangelizing. And I do all of that, the exposition, the expansion, the extrapolation, so that we can perhaps maybe apply some of this knowledge. As I say, I think it's of crucial importance to explore the work of Karl Popper, David Deutsch, and so on. Let me come back to that, but first let me just linger on this whole idea of evangelizing or defending an idea, or being an advocate for a moment. Being an advocate would be about defending a position. It's what one does in, for example, a debate. Now, it's different, strictly speaking, to having an understanding, which is what I'm trying to work towards. And explaining a position is different to defending a position. Because when you're explaining something, you can come to a new understanding of the very same idea that you were explaining, or at least to a deeper understanding. Some who defend a position might never really understand it. Religious fundamentalists do that. They might never really have an understanding of what their own religion teaches, but they're just going to defend it, and to the death. Or they might not. It doesn't matter. Maybe they do understand it, maybe they don't understand it. The point is, when it comes to me talking to the camera or into a microphone, such as I'm doing now, or having a discussion, my point is to try to explain things so that in the first instance, I test myself to see if I understand it. And then hopefully you might understand something a little more about what my position is, or what this position is that I'm trying to articulate. Defending the position is completely beside the point. Irrelevant. Not even a part of what I consider myself to be doing. And yet, those two different things can easily be mistaken for one another. Explaining a particular idea, defending a particular position. I know. People think that what I do all day long is defend David Deutsch and Karl Popper and critical rationalism, or whatever it happens to be, or capitalism and human flourishing, whatever it happens to be. They say that I am a dogmatist on these points. That's what I've heard sometimes. I guess that's like saying that someone like another great YouTuber that, well, I'm no great YouTuber, but someone who is a great YouTuber would be Veritasium, Aussie-American, who explains some wonderful ideas in physics and mathematics and even philosophy at times. You might say of him, well, he's an evangelist for science, or Carl Sagan was. Some people will say that, I grant it, but I think it misunderstands what's going on. At least, to my mind, what's happening in my mind. I can only speak for myself. I do have a luxury, and the luxury I have is time. I've got time to dive deep into ideas that I'm interested in, like physics and epistemology, economics to some extent, personhood, astrobiology, and the possibility of alien life and AGI, and all this stuff that I talk about. Lots of things that just pique my interest. And if people come to me with other things like, for example, some years ago, someone said, hey, these LLMs, these large language models, ChatGPT and so on and so forth, they seem to be intelligent. Let's really look into this. Are they? Are they generating new explanations? So I might have the luxury, as I say, to spend weeks or months diving deep on what an LLM is, how deep learning works. That's a luxury I understand and I accept. But it really is my own luxury, by the way. I'm certainly not living in luxury. Topcast survives on something approaching a shoestring. But so what? One of the most marvelous things about what I can do is to dive deep and learn lots that I otherwise would never have had an opportunity to, and explain some of it, sometimes, to some of you. In any case, I get to learn some really cool new stuff. When it comes to AI, for example, deep learning, neural nets and LLMs and so on, I get to learn how interesting and cool they are, and also come to understand that what they're doing isn't intelligent. It's not what people do. How do I know? Because I take the time to study both. How LLMs work, LLMs like ChatGPT, what they're doing at the level of code, and on the other hand, what people are doing when they create knowledge. I know something about that, what people do. Not everything, because no one does. I know something, and I really enjoy explaining it. As with physics, people say, look into this new cold fusion thing, Brett Hall, what do you think about it? Or this superconductivity thing, or whatever the new physics thing happens to be. And I do. I spend some time looking into it because I understand, for example, something already about what fusion is and how it works and what cold fusion is and the history of that. And there are heuristics that I can use, shortcuts to sift sense from nonsense when it comes to things in science, in particular physics. Of course, when it comes to something like cold fusion, it's usually nonsense, of course. Or if someone says they have a new theory of everything that's going to solve the Big Bang and what life is and how chemistry and physics and time and space and energy and all of it works, especially when it's getting a lot of public interest. I'll sometimes take time to look into it if it seems interesting and important, which is to say, I find it fun to learn about it, then I will take the time because, again, I have the luxury to do so. Even if something turns out after a week of investigation by me, a week of reading, talking to people, watching YouTubes and listening to podcasts, even if after that time and effort put into trying to understand something, it seems to turn out to be bogus or nonsense or a grift, as people say, written by a crank or someone who is crank adjacent, as I often like to say, it can still be a fruitful use of my time. Nothing is wasted. Learning nonsense is sometimes fruitful. How could that be so? Well, because it helps to clarify what the sense is if you learn sometimes about nonsense. So, for example, if you learn about chemistry, it can actually be instructive to learn about homeopathy. What am I talking about? Because if you can explain why homeopathy cannot possibly work, you'll recognize that there's something to understand there. Even nonsense, good nonsense of a kind. Homeopathy is good nonsense, by which I mean there is something there, a theory, a hypothesis that they have about how to dilute the active ingredient of something. And so they're 10x and 100x and 1000x dilutions, that means something. And if you can understand how to explain why it is that there can be no possibility of any active ingredient left in certain homeopathic remedies, then you've gone a good way to understanding not merely homeopathy, but what is true, namely actual chemistry. There is something to understand with certain kinds of nonsense, and then in other kinds of nonsense there's not a whole lot there. As I say, homeopathy is a good case in point. It's a whole thing, a whole complex system of understanding. It is wrong, it's flat out false, and it doesn't accord with reality. But there's a kernel of truth upon which they build their myths and misconceptions, upon errors and upon mistakes, and so on it goes. If you learn certain kinds of nonsense, it can be fun. And if you're coming from a place that you think makes sense, and you're trying to look at nonsense, you are trying to have your framework coincide with someone else's that is completely different. And it's also important at times, for people like me anyway, because if lots of people believe a particular thing, it can be important, not merely politically, scientifically, socially, any number of ways in which these movements, theories, hypotheses can gain traction, gain funding, gain influence. Scientology, other religions are a case in point, but there are certain scientific movements, scientists, thinkers, and so on, that can move the needle, as I've said more than once already in this episode, when it comes to trying to understand the direction in which our culture is moving, whether it be culture broadly or just scientifically. Knowledge, good explanations especially, can provide you with heuristics, because all knowledge is critical. Good explanations and not so good explanations are all criticisms of the alternatives. So I admit I have a framework, so to speak, but my framework does not prevent me from understanding anything else. As I say, I take deep interest sometimes in areas of complete nonsense. Homeopathy would be one. Postmodernism, relativism, these kind of bad philosophical movements. Crank science is something I'm really interested in because it persists, kind of like communism or Marxism. These people come into popular consciousness. They end up getting publicity and funding. And then they pour scorn upon the people upon whose shoulders they stand. There are people I have in mind when it comes to this. Many of you will know. This is why I take an interest in such things, because I think it's important that we understand not merely what is true, but also what we know to be incorrect, because so many people believe the wrong stuff. And there are criteria for deciding between sense and nonsense, knowledge and ignorance, better and worse explanations. So this is why sometimes I concentrate on the stuff that other people might not have an interest in. There are many things I don't have an interest in. Much of what passes for art, or movies, or sports, or the Australian Open tennis, as I speak right now, and I'm recording this, the men's semi-final is going on. I'll watch the recording of it later as soon as I finish doing this. I like tennis. I know what I enjoy, but I can't get super animated in general about sport, or movies, or music, or explaining my taste in, let's say, fantasy television shows and movies over hard sci-fi. I know a lot of other people who have a scientific mind. They enjoy science fiction and don't much like fantasy. I'm the opposite. I happen to like not merely Karl Popper, but Korean pop, both forms of K-pop. I like Apple products. It's not that I hate PC. I used to build my own personal computer, Intel-based, but now I'm really on board with Apple. I can't be bothered getting outside of the Apple environment very much. I like Apple products. But the debates between these things, what's better, K-pop music or Western music? Tennis versus football, Apple versus PC, and so on it goes. I can't get too excited about such debates. Politics, similarly, comes and goes, and on most topics, I have an opinion that many people can guess. I have a particular take on energy policy and take a deep interest in stuff like that. Defence and military I'm particularly interested in as well. I have a view on taxation and the role of government. So people do indeed say of me that Brett Hall, you're a cult member, or I'm an evangelist, or something because of the way in which I explain ideas, and I do get animated about it. But my animation and passion and my interest and the fun that I have, don't think of it as defending a position. It just appears that way. It can be easily mistaken, this passion, as being cultish or evangelizing or even simply defending something when I'm not. I'm just explaining things because I find it fun. And over time, I've managed to refine the way in which I explain things, and I can respond to questions pretty quickly because I've had them many times before. And when people come to me and say, oh, I have a different perspective, I will listen. Often I will say, well, I can't prophesy, I can always be wrong, we can both be wrong. But I will often say, here's the mistake in that because I will have heard it before. As many people will who are involved in science and philosophy and that kind of thing. And when you have ready answers for people, people can tend to get upset. They accuse you of dogmatism. But it's rather like the chemist who will say something like, look, chemical reactions really are due to electron transfer. That's what it's about. Not because this fluid called heat flows from substance to substance, initiating and maintaining chemical reactions. All the alternatives that are out there that would otherwise refute the idea that electrons are the things being transferred from here to there, well, all those are just false. So too with epistemology in certain areas of physics. But I still engage with people. I get it. People don't often like conjectural knowledge when they first hear about it. And they'll refuse to accept that this is the way in which knowledge works and grows and how it is that we can distinguish between good and bad explanations. But I like talking about this stuff. I like engaging people. And the engagement may seem like a debate, but it's not. Learning about misconceptions, about what other people already think about something you think you know something about, can be really interesting. And you can learn from someone who almost completely disagrees with you. But you can also be passionate about explaining. And I get that to some people, this seems like the same sort of passion that you see and hear in a preacher. The difference is, I really will change my mind. I know it doesn't seem like that sometimes, but who cares about seemings? The truth is, I will change my mind. I don't take anything on faith. I want to hear the alternatives to the things I discuss, and I've taken a long time to develop the perspective that I have. Decades. Because I do go looking into what I think of as the misconceptions in light of, for example, Karl Popper and David Deutsch's work. So let's come back to today, because today is very much about everything that I've just been talking about. Discussions, having discussions, differences of opinion. Telling people, as we often hear today, the refrain from many sides of politics and on podcasts in particular and on YouTube, people are talking about free speech. We know speech is important. Okay, level 1. Level 2, not merely that speech is important, but try to have a civil discussion. Keep it civil, keep it polite, so that the discussion keep on moving. Okay, there you go. All Talkcast listeners, take those things as read. That's background knowledge for all of us. It's discussions 101. But we, my listeners, want to level up. So what else remains when thinking about the purpose of discussions and how to have fruitful discussions, fun discussions? Assume we value free speech. We already do. Assume we value civility. Assume next that your interlocutor holds the polar opposite position to you. Now, especially assume that the polar opposite position you're about to encounter starts with polar opposite fundamental assumptions. The worldview that you're encountering might be completely different. Maybe you think the real world actually exists, but your interlocutor thinks that cannot possibly be known, or that we are in a simulation, or whatever it happens to be. This is the kind of thing we want to consider. So I want to take a deep dive into the writing of Karl Popper on this, because as with David Deutsch's work, each time you read it, there's something new, often, that you missed last time, or maybe you just forgot. Why do we talk to each other? Why do we discuss anything? I know it seems like a ridiculous, silly question. Let's avoid the whole "we're exchanging information" answer. In some situations, okay, fair enough, like the fireman turns up to your burning house and says, "Here, climb down this ladder to safety." Yes, okay, instructions are being given there and the exchange of information. So there is that situation. There's lots of situations like this. I mean, why chat to friends and peers and anyone at all when you've got a difference of opinion? Why have long conversations where it's, let's say, not bad news being delivered? Well, the first and primary reason is, as I have already said, fun. Popper, throughout this essay we're going to read together, says or uses the word enjoyment. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from learning. Learning, done right, is inherently fun. You're pushing yourself to the edge of what you already understand or can do, breaking through in order to correct an error and make progress. That's fun. You might learn when speaking to someone that there's something in their perspective you didn't know. So you will learn from them. But that's not the only way you could learn during the discussion. You could learn also from yourself. You could be talking and they say something and it leads you to a thought you hadn't had before about how to explain your very own position better and to understand it more deeply. This is another reason discussing stuff with other people can help a lot. You don't have to presume they know more than you. You can presume they know much less than you on a topic, and you might even be right about that. But you can still learn, if not from them, from the discussion. This is the situation many professional teachers and educators know so well. They learn from the questions asked. Everyone does. In any discussion, you cannot predict the growth of knowledge, as always. You may find the other person is wrong. You may learn your position even better than what you thought you knew about it. Everyone, I am sure, who's watching this, who's ever been in a classroom or gone to a university lecture, knows the experience or has had the experience of sitting there listening to the lecture and perhaps not quite following what's going on, but some other brave student puts up their hand, asks a question, you think, aha, that was the question I would have asked if only I had have been more brave, or if only I had have thought of it. And so you get insight, even if you're not part of the discussion. You're just listening to the discussion. You may sort of be a part of it by proxy, so to speak. Also, obviously, if you're involved in a discussion with someone, you might find the idea you already thought you understood, you find out actually it's false. You might understand the perspective of your interlocutor finally and agree, aha, they were right all along, I was wrong. Now I understand you, you think. And you might even say it to them. Or, yet again, another possibility, you might well think of the person you are having a chat with online or offline by text, in person, using your voice or whatever the medium happens to be. You might think, good, now I understand. I understand why you are wrong. You might not have fully understood why before, because you couldn't articulate their position quite properly. You knew there was a disagreement, but you didn't understand why. So you've learned something. Or you might very well understand how they are right and you are wrong, or how you are both wrong, and how perhaps no one, in truth, has a good solution at all. No one really understands the topic that you are discussing. There are deep misconceptions everywhere, you both might realise. Where we thought there was an understanding, each of you are coming to the conversation thinking that you both have a good explanation, and only by discussing do you realise that both of you are flawed in some way, and no one has a good explanation after all. It is, all of it, about understanding. Now again, it is easy to mistake this whole process if both people are coming from, a good place, a place of a genuine desire to openly explore particular ideas, come to an understanding. You might mistake that process, that objectively good process of trying to learn to understand something, with something like a debate where people will defend their position no matter what. Where looking from the outside, it can look the same, debates and discussions in that way. But there's a difference. The whole point in a debate, a high school debate or university debate, whatever it happens to be, the debates that people like Douglas Murray and Sam Harris are often involved in, where you're scoring points. The whole point of those debates is to win. You are trying to score points, so it is a win-lose situation. But in reality, of course, in discussions, we can have win-win. We can find out that one or both of us are wrong. Or we might not actually be able to demonstrate that one or both of us are wrong, but we learn something along the way. This is not lose-lose, it's win-win because both of us can gain something. Knowledge. In fact, even if one side concedes the other is correct, both can still learn something. The side that is acknowledged as being correct may come to a deeper understanding of their very own explanation that they are trying to help you understand. Or they may come away with a better way of framing their very own argument. In politics, it is often the case that once the party agrees on the policy, then the party members must defend and therefore debate against the opposition their policies. The quest for knowledge ends and all creativity is being deployed by the competing sides in order to win. All the creativity is being sucked up, so to speak, not by improving ideas or the substantive ideas, but rather how to use their brain power, their cognitive capacity, their creativity, to better come up with strategy to show the other side in a poor light. How to ignore the weak points in one's own position while talking up the flaws or perceived flaws in that of one's opponents and so on. That, to me, seems like hell. I wouldn't like to spend my time doing that. Simply proving the opposition is false. That's the inherent problem with politics. Discussions should be fun. I used to be a high school debater. I get the impulse. It can be like a sport there. It's sort of like intellectual mixed martial arts. But there is a better way. And I've since realised this upon many years hence having left behind the kind of professional debating, competitive debating. I realise now that I enjoy discussions, but only when the discussion seems like it will be fun. Discussions should be civil. That's certainly a precondition. When people start to get shouty or insulting or threatening and so on, well, that first criterion, I want it to be fun, is ruined quick smart. It can't be fun if it's not civil. Someone is defending their position, not trying to understand the other side. Generally, if someone disagrees with me, I want to understand why. On the internet, it's usually the case you can see where they are coming from. Like on X, for example, Twitter. You just check a person's posts if you don't know who they are and you don't know what their worldview and perspective is. Check their feed, see what they've been posting, and you can see what they think, how they generally craft their arguments, what their worldview is, what's animating them, what they repeatedly post about, what are they obsessed by. It's all there in their feed these days. You can get a real sense of a person. Not everything, but you can certainly get a sense. You can therefore sift who to respond to, and at what length, in what way. But it has to be fun. It has to be fun. If you're still not sure why someone is taking a particular position, but it is in opposition to you, they should, with some effort, be able to explain that position to your satisfaction. But no one is ever under any obligation here in the public square or on X or Facebook or social media broadly or the internet widely or anywhere. I guess a court of law might be an exception if you want to avoid that fine or going to jail. Popper spoke about all of this stuff, all about the purpose of discussions and how to have them. He talked about the so-called rules most public intellectuals defend when it comes to having rational discussions. And in his Popperian way, Karl Popper says, those rules, they're all wrong. There are ways to have discussions and there are purposes for discussions and the so-called clash of ideas or clash of cultures. And that, dear listener or viewer, is the reason for this series on the myth of the framework. So let's begin. The myth of the framework. Quote, those who believe this and those who do not have no common ground of discussion, but in view of their opinions, they must of necessity scorn each other. End quote. Plato. Karl Popper goes on, quote, one of the more disturbing aspects of the intellectual life of our time is the way in which irrationalism is so widely advocated, and the way in which irrationalist doctrines are taken for granted. One of the components of modern irrationalism is relativism, the doctrine that truth is relative to our intellectual background, which is supposed to determine somehow the framework within which we are able to think that truth may change from one framework to another, and in particular, the doctrine of the impossibility of mutual understanding between different cultures, generations, or historical periods, even within science, even within physics. In this paper, I discussed the problem of relativism. It is my claim that behind it lies what I call the myth of the framework. I explain and criticize this myth and comment also on arguments that have been used in its defense. The proponents of relativism put before us standards of mutual understanding which are unrealistically high. And when we fail to meet those standards, they claim that understanding is impossible. Against this, I argue that if common goodwill and a lot of effort are put into it, then very far-reaching understanding is possible. Furthermore, the effort is amply rewarded by what we learn in the process about our own views, as well as about those we are setting out to understand. This paper sets out to challenge relativism in its widest sense. It is important to present such a challenge, for today the increasing escalation in the production of weapons has made survival almost identical with understanding. End quote from Karl Popper there. Well, there we go. What a beginning. We have Karl Popper here right at the outset saying that he is tackling relativism in this essay in its widest sense. Now, he has a little pang of pessimism there at the end. He's thinking, I presume, nuclear weapons, fission and fusion type, and guessing that if people cease talking, they begin fighting. And this idea that if you think your enemy is beneath even speaking to, or that talking is of no use, or talking cannot even be possible because not only are your languages different, never mind translators and interpreters, but your entire worldviews, your frameworks are so far apart that it's all a waste of time. Now that is dangerous. Let's pick a great danger now in the West. Islamism. That brand of Islam which is determined to literally try and take over the world, or some large part of the world, violently, and convert whole nations into part of a so-called caliphate, an Islamic state spread by the sword. Okay, that's a framework. Islamism is a framework. The West is a framework. Now, if on the one hand one side thinks Islam is the only legitimate way for a society to be organised and all alternatives are destined for eternal hellfire, and the other side thinks that is a recipe for the death of civilization, what is there to talk about? Well, as Popper says, we will survive and thrive only if we understand and can come to a way of discussing with our enemies, especially in the cases where they have weapons similar to ours. Now, often this isn't the case. Islamism, for example, isn't that powerful, although terrorism happens and we don't want it to continue to happen. But this whole thing might be very true of China. They have weapons not equal to ours, but it could be very damaging. We don't want to stop the discussions. We don't want to stop talking. The West does not want to go to war with Islamism, or China, or Russia. We want them to become like us. We want the members of those societies to be persuaded by themselves, by their own light, that the West is better. We want them to make a peaceful transition, to understand Enlightenment values, recognise there's a better way. And that comes through discussion, not coercion, and not war, unless there is literally no option. And they start it. So the stakes are high, extremely high. Let's continue on to section 2. Section 2, and Karl Popper writes, quote, "Although I am an admirer of tradition and conscious of its importance, I am at the same time an almost orthodox adherent of unorthodoxy. I hold that orthodoxy is the death of knowledge, since the growth of knowledge depends entirely on the existence of disagreement. Admittedly, disagreement may lead to strife and even to violence. And this, I think, is very bad indeed, for I abhor violence. Yet disagreement may also lead to discussion, to argument, and to mutual criticism. And these, I think, are of paramount importance. I suggest that the greatest step towards a better and more peaceful world was taken when the war of swords was first supported and later sometimes even replaced by a war of words. This is why my topic is of some practical significance." End quote. Well there, a dynamic society Karl Popper is talking about. Stable, under rapid change. The stable part is the maintenance of, I would suggest, certain kinds of tradition of criticism, or institutions broadly, so that we don't get caught in a revolution, let's say. We keep democracy, we keep free trade, we keep speech and so on, we protect individual rights and those kind of things. But at the same time, keeping all those traditions of the Enlightenment in place, also, if I'm not using the word tradition in a perverted way, by saying free speech is a tradition we like to uphold, and democracy is a tradition we like to uphold, and capitalism is a tradition we like to uphold, and those things. The traditions that allow us to have rapid change. We want all of those things. We want those kind of orthodoxies, if you like, so that we can have the unorthodox, the rapid change. We need both. I once wrote about the constant and the variable, or in the British parliamentary constitutional monarchy idea, the dignified and the efficient, as it's called there, the monarchy and the parliament in the UK, respectively. One thing stays the same, basically, over the decades and the centuries, indeed millennia, while the other is the agent of change. Both are important. And as Popper says, the war of swords can be replaced by a war of words. How poetic. We want to know how to have a war of words so things do not devolve into a war of swords, whether interpersonally or internationally. Let's go on to part 3. Karl Popper writes, quote, "But first, let me explain what my topic is and what I mean by my title, The Myth of the Framework. I will discuss and argue against a myth, a false story that is widely accepted, especially in Germany. From there it invaded America, where it became almost all-pervasive among intellectuals and where it forms the background of some of the most flourishing schools of philosophy. So I fear that the majority of my present readers may also believe in the myth, either consciously or unconsciously. The myth of the framework can be stated in one sentence, as follows. A rational and fruitful discussion is impossible unless the participants share a common framework of basic assumptions, or at least unless they have agreed on such a framework for the purpose of discussion. This is the myth I'm going to criticize." End quote. So that's the myth of the framework. The idea there are things we need to agree on first before we can begin any discussion. I guess we can both agree, as I said near the outset, not to punch each other in the face. Okay, that goes without saying. So he can't just be saying that. What do you mean? He means we do not have to first agree on things like, here is an example that I get continuously, right? Online, in person, whenever people want to talk to me about certain things. One thing that crops up quite often, whether I'm talking about education, the purpose of schooling, IQ tests, AI or AGI. I can almost set my watch once we get deep into the weeds of talking about these issues. Within 10 minutes, someone, my interlocutor, is going to want to know what exactly I mean by, or how I define, the word intelligence. They seem to think that unless we can first agree on what intelligence is, we can't discuss the possibility of the reality of IQ, the predictability of IQ tests, the possibility of AGI and superintelligence and so on. But we can. We can put all of that to one side. We don't have to agree on what the word intelligence means. If that's a controversial word to use, let's use another. Let's just talk about people and what makes people special in terms of their minds. So my conversations on these kind of topics, and this is just one to pick, I could pick any number of controversial topics that I like to spend my time talking about. The multiverse would be another, the universality of computation would be another, but never mind all that. In conversations that have anything to do with intelligence, whether it's AI, whether it's schooling, whether it's IQ tests, whatever, there's a pattern of the way in which these discussions tend to go. I'm interested in the unique capacity to create that people have. What do my interlocutors say? Well, almost immediately they will come up with something like, it's not unique. What are you talking about, Brett? It's not unique. I mean, if you do not think that people are unique in their capacity to generate explanatory knowledge in the way that we do, and that bees can do a version of it, and bears can do a version of it, so LLMs can do a version of it, look out your window now if you're in a city and explain all of those structures and that technology. Why aren't bees and bears building any of that? LLMs like ChatGPT are intelligent, is what they say. That's the most recent objection that I get to all of this. Okay, but who created the LLMs, the large language models? What gives us the capacity to invent things like LLMs? And then they'll say any number of things, my interlocutor. And they might say something like, token prediction. It's the fancy term for how an LLM works. They'll say something like that. Attention, as described in the Transformer paper, Attention is All You Need, one of the first papers that laid the foundations for coding work on LLMs and neural networks. They will say to me, look, it's just a neural net, and that's the way in which token prediction works, and that is why these things are intelligent. Of course, that's circular reasoning. It begs the question, how did we, people, first understand token prediction so that we could program our computers to do it? And then what they'll say is, well, that's because you as a human being, us as human beings, we use token prediction. That's how our brains work. Oh. In any case, I can learn something from such discussions, frustrating as they can be sometimes. Namely, my explanation is not yet clear enough. I have to rephrase, and that's fun. I'll usually go back to talking about explanations and how new good explanations are generated and what creativity is in my mind and how LLMs aren't creative in that sense that we are. But those people who, for example, insist that AI as it exists now is already conscious and creative and so on, we do exist in different frameworks. But I say, to some extent, I understand what they are saying because I understand that perspective. It's a perspective I used to have, so I get it. I could defend the thesis, for example, a pocket calculator is intelligent, super intelligent, for some sense of the word intelligent. But the sense I'm after is different. It's to do with genuine newness, innovation, curiosity, interest, self-prompting. It ties creativity to a kind of motivation, which is bringing in this concept of consciousness and free will to our understanding of creativity and what that entire constellation of capacities is that creative people have. The capacity to even have a problem in the first place and pursue a number of solutions. So let's recap what the myth of the framework actually is. Again, quote from Popper. A rational and fruitful discussion is impossible unless the participants share a common framework of basic assumptions, or at least unless they have agreed on such a framework for the purpose of the discussion. This is the myth I am going to criticize, wrote Popper. And he continues, quote, as I have formulated it here, the myth sounds like a sober statement or like a sensible warning to which we ought to pay attention in order to further rational discussion. Some people even think that what I describe as a myth is a logical principle or based on a logical principle. I think, on the contrary, that it is not only a false statement but also a vicious statement, which, if widely believed, must undermine the unity of mankind and so must greatly increase the likelihood of violence and of war. This is the main reason why I want to combat it and to refute it. As indicated, I mean by framework here a set of basic assumptions or fundamental principles, that is to say an intellectual framework. It is important to distinguish such a framework from some attitudes which may indeed be preconditions for a discussion, such as a wish to get to or nearer to the truth and a willingness to share problems or to understand the aims and the problems of someone else. End quote there from Popper. I just want to quibble a little here that I stand upon the shoulders of ye giants in Popper and Deutsch. And when Popper says that he wants to get to the truth or nearer to the truth, and he quotes and will quote once again Xenophanes, that all is a woven web of guesses and so on, as for certain truth no man can have it, all that kind of thing. I think it's quite fine to speak of truth, and I'm a defender, for want of another term, of truth and its existence and its objectivity. However, our quest should not be to find truth or even to get nearer to the truth, because we cannot know that we've gotten any nearer to it. There's no way of understanding that. But what we can hope to do, following Popper, is to solve our problems. Objectively speaking, we know when our problem is solved, at least to our satisfaction. And we can know objectively when we have corrected an error, when we've detected an error and then corrected the error. But we can't know we've gotten any closer to the truth. So I think that sometimes, although it can be useful to frame things in terms of truth, that is the exception. The rule should be a focus on error detection and correction. And that's what Popper would have been better here to have phrased this way of talking about the purpose of discussion. So let me read what he wrote again, and then I would ever so slightly rephrase the great philosopher. He wrote, quote, "It is important to distinguish such a framework from some attitudes which may indeed be preconditions for a discussion, such as a wish to get to or nearer to the truth and a willingness to share problems, etc." Now, what if, instead of saying that, he said a wish to detect and to correct errors and a willingness to share problems and so on? You never have to mention truth, but you could talk about objective knowledge. A wish to get to a place where there are fewer errors, better explanations, objective knowledge, and so on. In any case, that's a side point, because what Popper is talking about here is that we want to avoid increasing the likelihood of violence and war. And so therefore, this notion that you must already share a framework with someone, or else there's no speaking to them, is, as he says, going to increase the likelihood of violence and war. It's a vicious claim. If you think you cannot talk to someone unless and until you share some common basic principles first, you're bound to avoid some important discussions that could avoid violence where violence could have been avoided. Police always try talking to criminals first, or suspects. It's rarely all guns blazing, except in the most urgent of circumstances, when there are literally no alternatives left. But generally that's a last resort. First resort and second resort and third resort is, let's talk, let's discuss. Incidentally, to bring this to a modern day example, I know something about. Should we talk to North Korea or not? And this is where I disagree with people or otherwise allies of mine, on my side, conservatives and so on. Should the American president speak to the leader of North Korea? Again, when I listen to some conservative or libertarian or even objectivist commentators on this, I find them, on many other topics, insightful, even inspiring. But on this, North Korea, because I understand something about it, I cringe. They will say things of Kim Jong-un, for example, that are so far off base that I think it's embarrassing how ignorant some people who otherwise are very good on politics and global affairs would be. They will say things like, Kim Jong-un is an awful, violent dictator of the worst order. The worst of the worst, beyond the pale, and so it goes with all the epithets that people will throw at Kim Jong-un, the third member of the Kim dynasty to be in charge of North Korea. When those commentators from the West, English-speaking usually, say of Kim Jong-un that he's beyond the pale and that no one should talk to him, that he and his regime are beneath speaking to, the West shouldn't bother, I think that is a terrible mistake. Because here's what I know. North Korea exists within a political framework known as Juche. You can look this up. Juche has more than a dash of Marxism, communism, collectivism in it, but it is uniquely, characteristically Korean. It's about self-sufficiency. It applies to everyone, from the farmer through to the factory worker, the bureaucrat, the party officials, and the inner circle around the leader and the leader himself. These people, the North Koreans, really do believe this stuff. Juche, form of Marxism. Let's say Kim Jong-un, the present leader of North Korea, just wakes up one day in the near future, perhaps he already has, and understands the entire system in North Korea in which he is operating in is bankrupt in many ways. Politically, philosophically, economically. Let's say he comes to that recognition, that it's all bad. It's a terrible way for North Korea to organise society. What does he do? What can he do? Well, on the assumption that he's a ruthless, evil tyrant, and yet he's had this road to Damascus conversion, should he just begin to turn the wheels in order to begin changing things so that they can have freedom and liberty and capitalism there in North Korea. That would be ideal. But here's the problem. He can't. He is politically incapable of doing that to a very large extent. He knows full well that his people, everywhere from the farmer through to the military and his inner circle, have been indoctrinated, as he was. Is he going to tell high-ranking officials his ideas first before they're implemented? That has to be the case. Whether you're the king or the emperor or whoever you are, you have to tell someone else to go and tell someone else to enact the policy that you want. So if you want to change from this strict communist society into a more capitalist one, well, okay, begin telling your generals and your ministers and so on what you want done. What do you think will happen in that situation? He has to tell his high-ranking officials what to do before they're implemented. Let's see how that works. Off he goes down the hallway and talks to Sun Yi or Min Sing Yung or Park Dae Sung or whoever the Korean happens to be. And he says to them, listen, Grand Marshal or Great General or Commissioner or whoever it happens to be, we're going to begin implementing more free trade in North Korea. Well, the very next meal that Kim Jong-un has might just have a little polonium sprinkled on it. And he knows this full well. The whole society of North Korea is a victim of an ideology. It's a framework of memes imprisoning the citizens, the leaders, and even the guy at the top. The guy at the top simply is not free to radically change things. He is the figurehead of a communist revolution, and the revolution has not been perfected. It's not been perfectly well implemented yet. Everyone is watching everyone else in North Korea. It is difficult to express what it's like to be in such a society. But if you exist in the framework of, oh, well, North Korea must just be like the United States, except it's more harsh. Well, the president of North Korea is basically like the president of the United States. You know, they can dictate orders to people, but they're free to do what they like. It's just not so. At best, the leader of North Korea can nudge this huge, vast cargo vessel, if you like, a little off course. That's what North Korean society is like. It's a vast ship that is powering itself through the ocean against particular currents. Now, the leader of North Korea, the present leader, Kim Jong-un right now, is indeed trying to implement changes. There have been incremental changes, some free markets and so on. Now, I don't know what the solution to the North Korean problem is, but I know that Kim Jong-un himself, the entire Kim dynasty, well, they're victims as well. It might not seem that way, and it might seem a perversion of the way in which the word victim is being used there. But it genuinely is the case that these people are the products of a particular ideology, and they have memes running on their minds that are causing them to behave in certain ways, and they can't simply turn on a dime and change things, even if they're the person at the top. Sure, the poverty-stricken farm workers are far worse off than people in the Kim dynasty. And of course, yes, Kim Jong-un has a lot more power than your typical farmer. Of course. But he does not have absolute power. The system itself is more like the dictator than a leader is. The system, as I say, is more like a huge ship going full steam ahead, promoting this idea of juche. And at best, Kim Jong-un is something more like the captain of that ship. But captains of ships, huge big military ships or cargo vessels, generally don't have their hands on the wheel. They can give orders, for example, to the pilot of the ship, the person who's actually at the wheel driving the ship. But imagine the situation where the pilot is himself being watched by many armed guards, all of whom have some expectation of what should be done next and where the ship should be going. And if any sudden movements are made, they're going to jump on the pilot, perhaps even the captain. In this circumstance, the rest of the world should talk and trade with Kim Jong-un and North Korea and allow little inroads and break it down from the inside. That's what we can hope for. Not just changing things immediately by fiat. It's not going to work. Let the people in North Korea understand by their own lights there's a better way. Because at the moment, it remains largely, as it has often been called, a hermit kingdom. It's just not like the way in which East Germany was in the 70s and 80s. They, the East Germans, could see the new cars, for example, driving around in the West. Often from West Germany, they'd go to East Germany and go driving around the roads. This was one of the reasons why the wall eventually fell, because the East Germans understood what was going on in West Germany and why it was better there. The North Koreans are not quite like this. Although it's been many decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the people in North Korea just do not have access to what it's like in South Korea or China or Europe or the United States or anything like that. They really are trapped inside the hermit kingdom. The West might not have much in common with North Korea, but we do not need to share much in order for problems to be solved by helping each other and discussing. Especially discussing in order to avoid violence and maybe move the needle a little when it comes to the poor denizens trapped there north of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Now, this kind of situation is an extreme one. We can say something similar with respect to Israel and Gaza, or the West and the Iranian regime. Now, in a sense, there is no negotiating with people who insist on your death and eradication from the face of the earth. But if they know you will also eradicate them, so long as they have that policy, and they will lose, for them to know that takes discussion. Then there's de-escalation, and then in a place like Gaza, learning just might happen. If the West can take over the schools that are in Gaza, for example, and help the next generation know better, then the problem really is soluble. As David Deutsch says on this conflict, my paraphrasing of his pinned tweet as of January 2025, this is my paraphrasing. First, he prescribes defeating the genocidal Islamists utterly. Once that is done, decisively eliminate fear in the populace in Gaza. The people have to know their evil leaders are gone, that no one's going to kill them and hurt them now. And the West certainly is not there to murder them, as they have been taught to murder Jews. They, the people in Gaza, need to learn about laws and what a law-abiding society is in order for their society, their city, to function. Then they can learn about progress, how to have a better life through trade and commerce. And after a while, then they can have democracy. All of this is going to take discussion with the relevant people, the leaders, whoever they end up being in Gaza, and the citizens themselves. Their minds need to be changed. They, the people in Gaza, are victims, not of Israel, but of ideas implanted in their heads over decades of indoctrination. Those ideas need to be criticised and erased and replaced with better, more peaceful, more sensible, rational ideas. And that takes effort and discussion. We cannot think, well, look, they're too far gone. There's no talking to them ever. That is a recipe for disaster. People can and do convert out of the worst religions, and often, or become less fundamentalist and more moderate. It happens. Let's go back to the paper. Karl Popper goes on, quote, "Let me say at once that the myth contains a kernel of truth. Although I contend that it is a most dangerous exaggeration to say that a fruitful discussion is impossible unless the participants share a common framework, I am very ready to admit that a discussion among participants who do not share a common framework may be difficult. A discussion will also be difficult if the frameworks have little in common. And it will be the easier the greater the overlap between the frameworks. Indeed, if the participants agree on all points, it may turn out to be an easy, smooth and rational discussion, though perhaps a little boring. But what about fruitfulness? In the formulation I gave of the myth, It is a fruitful discussion which is declared impossible. Against this, I shall defend the directly opposite thesis that a discussion between people who share many views is unlikely to be fruitful, even though it may be pleasant. While a discussion between vastly different frameworks can be extremely fruitful, even though it may sometimes be extremely difficult and perhaps not quite so pleasant, though we may learn to enjoy it. End quote. Okay, so what's Popper saying? Well, he's saying if we agree with each other all the time, we may not have fruitful discussions. So what is fruitful then? Well, fruits have seeds and they cause growth. In other words, new problems arise and you need to conjecture new solutions. This is creativity. This is what's happening in fruitful discussions. Seeds planted, new growth happens, new problems, new solutions. Now, my guess is that in reality, this cannot happen, this idea that people won't have fruitful discussions, because individuals, as we have said, are so different from one another, they may as well be different biological phyla. See what I did there? Not just different species. People are different one from another, even if they exist or come from the same culture, if they have the same gender and sexuality, job, and share a whole bunch of their own opinions, not all of their ideas will be perfectly identical. That's impossible after all. But we often fail to have fruitful discussions. Okay, that's okay. But if you want to solve problems and have fun, the point is it might be difficult at times. If reaching agreement or persuading someone is your aim, you may get frustrated. Instead, look at a discussion where the other person differs with you as a way to, first, understand their perspective and why they hold it. After all, they may be right. And if you think you do understand their perspective and why they hold it, then try to understand why they aren't accepting your argument. Can you rephrase what you're trying to say? It must be your fault to some extent if people aren't agreeing with you. So there has to be a learning opportunity always, should you wish to take the opportunity. A way for things to be fruitful could be to figure out how to learn your own side of the case better, so as to understand it more deeply and correct misconceptions about it, as apparently your interlocutor has. All right, let's conclude part 3 of this lecture. Popper goes on to say, quote, I think that we may say of a discussion that it was the more fruitful, the more its participants were able to learn from it. And this means the more interesting questions and difficult questions they were asked, the more answers they were induced to think of, the more they were shaken in their opinions, and the more they could see things differently after the discussion. In short, the more their intellectual horizons were extended. Fruitfulness, in this sense, will almost always depend upon the original gap between the opinions of the participants in the discussion. The greater the gap, the more fruitful the discussion can be. Always provided, of course, that such a discussion is not altogether impossible, as the myth of the framework asserts. End quote. Just my reflection. So, fruitful discussions are learning experiences. You may learn from the other person. They may learn from you. Both may happen. You may learn from yourself. They may learn from themselves. Remember, knowledge is created from within, not from without. It comes from within. So in any discussion, you are also listening to yourself as well as the other person that you're speaking with. You are creating your arguments and explanations on the spot, and you cannot predict the growth of knowledge, not even your own. You can refine your arguments and explanations. Learning is just happening all the time in a fruitful discussion. Okay, not all the time, a lot of the time. You need not win. That's not the point. Indeed, you should be happy to be shown wrong, because that's a win. You've learned something. Maybe you just learned that which I said right now. Being proved wrong can be a source of joy. Okay, this first episode has been a gradual introduction. We are now beginning part 4 of a 16-part lecture, but I wanted to set the scene at length and tell a few anecdotes along the way. Before we take off at pace next time, I find this whole topic absolutely fascinating. If only people in politics would take Karl Popper more seriously. We need oppositions and adversarial government, but we don't always need to have debates where it's just win-lose. We can have win-win in discussions, political or otherwise. We could have more political discussions online, on TV, in person, in podcasts, between politicians and so on, even between governments and their oppositions. I imagine in a more enlightened world, this would happen because politicians would give up the desire to win and replace it with how to better create policy and change policy through discussions. So, let us replace the question in politics of who won the debate with the question, what new knowledge was created during the discussion between the candidates? Well, we can dream, I suppose. Until next time, bye-bye.